dead or alive? For most of human history, the answer to that question was fairly straightforward. Now, it's not so simple, according to emergency and intensive care unit Dr. Blair Bigham. Doctors, nurses, and paramedics work wonders every day. But does it come with hidden costs, borne not just by medical professionals, but by all of us? He takes up such questions in his new book. It's called Death Interrupted: How Modern Medicine is Complicating the Way We Die. Dr. Blair Bigham joins us now in studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so this field is not for everybody. I'm curious, how did you become interested in emergency medicine in the first place?
Yeah, I guess it goes all the way to my childhood when I was in the pool all the time swimming, and that naturally progressed to being a lifeguard. Met a couple paramedics, thought, wow, this stuff's really cool, and then eventually followed in their footsteps and became a paramedic. And after a couple of years doing that, realized that I wanted longer interactions with people, and so I went to medical school, got into emergency medicine and critical care, and I've never looked back.
All right, and we talked about this just before the taping about our favorite shows. Mine is Grey's Anatomy. People who might be watching near-death, resuscitation, and hospital culture from watching TV or movies may not have a real understanding of how maybe different it is or what it really is. Can you tell us sort of the realities of that from TV show to sort of the inside the ICU?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time on TV, and we know from a really neat study where researchers actually watched hundreds of episodes of medical dramas and found that the survival rate from people whose heart stopped was around 90% on television. Oh. But in real life, we know it's closer to 10%. And so we've sort of oversold what resuscitation can accomplish and maybe created some unrealistic expectations in society. Oftentimes, on television, after resuscitation, people just wake up, they're talking, they're moving, they feel well. It's sort of like a very exciting opportunity. But in real life, even a successful resuscitation is not marked with somebody talking to us or being awake. It's marked by maybe a return of a weak pulse, or things that don't necessarily mean that you're going to wake up, walk out of the hospital, and live a good life.
I want to pick up on a point that you had mentioned in terms of you were a paramedic in your early days, both in the air and on the ground, and then you transitioned to being an ICU doctor. How is dealing with an emergency situation different in those two different situations?
As a paramedic, you walk into a scene that has just happened. Someone's just dialed 911. Normally, someone's maybe collapsed just a few minutes ago. You have very little time to collect information. You have very little time to build rapport with family members. And so you're in this mode of rapid action, and you're resuscitating people. Often you're rushing to hospital with lights and sirens, and then you drop the person off in the emergency department, and then you're done. Like, you don't have any idea what happens next. You never see the family again. You might not even know if the patient survived. So it's a very intense but short duration interaction with someone's life where you're trying your best to save it, but you don't know if your actions actually led to the outcome that you wanted. Once you're in the emergency department, instead of having minutes with someone, you might have hours with someone. But even that I found a little unsatisfying, because then again, they get whisked off to the operating room or the intensive care unit or transferred to another hospital, and you're kind of left in the same boat. You don't know what happened to them. You never see them again. In the intensive care unit, instead of minutes or hours, you're usually with people for days, sometimes weeks. You get to know them, you get to know their families, and you really get to see that slow recovery that we just spoke about happen or not happen. And you get a better appreciation, I think, for the limitations of what we can accomplish as physicians. Whereas as a paramedic or an emergency doctor, I often have a lot of hope, but not a lot of long-term insight into what my actions actually did.
All right, I want to do a little bit of a history lesson because you did this in your book, and I'm hoping you can describe how death was sort of determined throughout history, from several decades ago to where we are now.
Yeah, so it used to be really easy because there wasn't anything to do, per se, when someone got really sick. There weren't antibiotics, there weren't ventilators, there weren't infusion pumps with vasoactive medications. There was really not a lot to do when someone was in the end stages of their life. Often people wouldn't even be taken to a hospital. They would just kind of get sick and die in their own bed. And that allowed their family to be part of the dying process. People would watch their parents die, their grandparents die. And so they became sort of familiar with death, comfortable with death in a way. Once the 60s came around And then certainly in the 70s, technology advanced to the point where doctors could actually do something for someone who wasn't able to breathe on their own, for example. We could hook them up to machines, we could hook them up to medications, and we could push them through critical illness to the point where sometimes they survived. And so that led to sort of the medicalization of death. People began coming to hospitals. Hospitals developed special units called intensive care units where these very, very sick people would go. And so instead of dying at home, sort of resigned to the fact that there was nothing to be done, people began coming to hospitals, began being intervened upon. And that sort of led to this point now where very few people die at home. Most people will die outside of their home. And many people die in an ICU with sort of maximal intervention occurring. And even now we know that as good as our technology is, as much as we've advanced the science of critical care, at some point everyone's going to die. And often that's on my watch because I have nothing left to offer.
All right, there's a couple of terms that you use interchangeably in your book. You use dead to describe someone who's dead, or even very dead sometimes to describe it. Can we get sort of, what is the medical criteria for death right now?
Sure. So generally we think of someone being dead as when their heart stops beating. And that's certainly what I use to diagnose death all the time. If you don't have a pulse, I diagnose you as dead if I'm not able to restart it after a couple of minutes, maybe half an hour. Sometimes I'll push a resuscitation to 1 hour, someone who was found drowned in a lake and they're hypothermic. But generally, you have maybe 15 to 30 minutes of a resuscitation, and if I don't get your pulse back, you're dead.
Okay.
In my book, I use the term dead because when you're pulseless and we're intervening upon you, we sort of have this lingo amongst us where we use the term dead or very dead to describe someone for whom there's no more hope, there's no more intervention, there's no more effort at resuscitation. And where this comes into play in the ICU is that it gets a little bit more complicated than just, do you have a pulse? Because now we have machines that can generate a pulse. We have machines that can circulate blood when your heart's not beating. We have a lot of technology that means having a pulse isn't necessarily good enough to be declared alive. And where it gets even more complicated is when we talk about brain death. Now that we have a lot of technology, you can actually have a pulse and be dead. We can be generating a pulse. Your heart has a beautiful feature. It's miraculous. It's called automaticity, where it sets its own heart rate. Even if I cut off your head, even if you don't have a head, your heart will beat on its own until it runs out of blood. It's a really interesting feature of the human body. And now that we have technology that can support respirations, which is normally the brain's job to tell you to breathe, it can support heartbeats, it can support blood pressure, we can feed you through an IV or through a tube in your stomach. We can do all these things that don't really require that you have a brain. And so in the ICU, we often have patients who are brain dead who, and the criteria for brain dead is very clear. If your brain ceases to function, you are unable to breathe on your own. And so it's sort of a backwards death in a way. Normally your heart stops and then your brain dies because there's no blood flow. In this case, your brain has died, and so under normal circumstances you wouldn't breathe, and so then your heart would stop.
Right.
But now that I can intervene upon the breathing bit, you can kind of be half alive. Your body is still ticking, but your brain is never going to recover.
Well, let's talk about that. So I want to actually read a quote from your book that looks at this. Let's have that come up. And it reads, "I can take over nearly every aspect of your physiology. Most times I win this battle against death. Organ function recovers, laboratory results improve, patients get better, they wake up, they walk out of the hospital, and they return to their families and friends and jobs and debts and everything else. But then there are times I lose. A slow decomposition, one organ at a time, into oblivion. The problem is this. There comes a point where I know I will lose, but I don't know exactly when. There won't be a return to life, but the line of death hasn't been crossed. It is a no man's land where no person ever wants to be." In that, you sort of describe what I just read. You also say later on that preventing death doesn't equal saving a life, and I'm hoping you can sort of unpack that for us.
Sure. So there's two things in there. The first is that often people, this might sound cruel, but we would use the term unsalvageable sometimes. They're too sick to be saved. Their physiology is too damaged. Their disease is too advanced. And we're supporting them with a ton of life support, and we know that it's not working. Usually we see the doses of our life support medications going up, the ventilator doing more work, not less work. And we sort of realize that we've hit a ceiling of what we can provide. And then we just kind of slowly watch the body deteriorate over a matter of minutes or hours or maybe days. But we know that the writing's on the wall. And so that circumstance happens in the ICU quite frequently. There are other times where we get to a point where you're not going to die, we've prevented death, but we also know that there's so much damage to your body that you're very unlikely to recover very well. Certainly not to your baseline, not to where you were before you came to the ICU. Maybe what that looks like is you're in a nursing home for the rest of your life. Maybe you're able to acknowledge people around you by blinking, maybe by moving your mouth, but you're probably not going to be able to speak. You may not even be able to appreciate your surroundings. And so that's sort of this gray zone we get into where in our resuscitation, where our hope was that you would recover more fully, we've gotten to a point where you are very disabled. And maybe not able to appreciate the world around you. And many people would find that circumstance unacceptable. They wouldn't want to live like that. But it's very hard as an ICU doctor because in order to get the good outcome you want, you have to risk that bad outcome, or you have to just stop and accept death. So there's a rolling of the dice that happens when we go full court press to try to save someone's life, where we hope that they come out in a capacity that they would accept, but we know that we may only get halfway. And that can be a really challenging decision point for families, for patients, and for their physicians.
Ultimately, in your book, you are trying to solve what you call the death dilemma, and you come up with an equation. We normally don't do math on this program, but we're going to show a little bit of math. It's mostly words. And you write, technology times resuscitation and glorification plus death denialism equals false hope. False hope drives us to push on in the face of dismal odds. It means that we set aside one of the most important tools in medicine, palliative care, until I would argue the window for effective palliative measures has mostly closed and it is too late to undo extraordinary suffering. Can you unpack that and sort of that equation as well?
Yeah. So let's start at the end of that. And I would say, how would you want to die? And most people would tell me, I would want to die at home in my bed, surrounded by my loved ones, without any pain or anxiety. But that is not what they tell me when they're facing that moment, when they're in the ICU, when they're in the emergency department. They don't say, oh, I'd like to go home and die in peace. They say, I would like you to try everything you can to save my life, even when we all know that we're kind of beyond that. And so that is a lost opportunity for some people to be able to have meaningful interactions with the people they care about in the time they have left. Because instead of palliative care or comfort measures, we push on and medicalize them to the point where perhaps they're on a breathing machine, sedated, they can't interact with people. And so when I say dismal odds, there's often some odds that you might push through, but the odds are really low. And if we roll the dice, then you lose that opportunity. So let's go back to the equation. Let's say that you're going to roll the dice. The reason we can do that is because of technology. If we didn't have technology, I throw up my hands. There's nothing I can do, right? If you ever had a cardiac arrest in the middle of a desert, there's not much I'm going to do to save you. I need my toolkit. I need my nurses. I need my respiratory therapists. I need my pharmacists. Otherwise, you're not going to survive. And so technology is the enabler, and that's why there's a multiplication sign beside it, because you take it out and nothing else matters. But where we get into the situation of false hope or maybe unreasonable hope, those dismal odds, is that two things have happened in society. And the first goes back to what we were talking about with television. We've glorified resuscitation. We've oversold our capabilities. People think that we can save them every time. And so families say, do everything.
Right.
And that's a very difficult position to be in. And then we also have an additional complication, which we haven't spoken about yet, which I've titled death denialism, where in society today, we have a lot of privilege. We have a lot of aspects of our world that reflect ourselves back in our own faces. And so we have this really inflated sense of self-worth and ego. And it's created sort of a world where people think that they have the right to live forever. They don't understand sometimes or appreciate that death comes for us all. And so that's created a situation not only where you think all these tools will work, when often they won't, but you also feel that death just, like, why would I die? Why do I have to die? We have all these tools, we have all these technologies, people just think that they can go on forever. And technology has enabled that shift in society from where we used to be very comfortable with death because it happened in our homes, we watched it happen to our loved ones, to a point now where we almost deny that death is coming, even when it's very clear that it's happening. So it's created a real conundrum.
You've talked about sort of death not only in someone's home, can be in the back of an ambulance, can be in an ICU, can be in a television screen. I want to talk about ones that sometimes end up in courtrooms, because you've talked about that in your book as well, and it was a big case. The battle over end-of-life heroics can be legal, can kind of be where many doctors probably don't want to be. You were in that courtroom for one case. This was Takesha McKitty. Can you give us a little background about her story and sort of what happened there?
Sure. This is a really fascinating area of medicine. It's a very tragic case of a woman who was declared brain dead by her physicians, by multiple physicians. And for me, brain death is certain death. It's very clear that when your brain meets certain criteria for death, that you are never going to wake up, you're never going to recover, you are entirely dependent on machines, and your brain has died. There's nothing left to salvage there. And in this very interesting, sad case, the family was not accepting of that diagnosis of death. And so normally when someone has died, we don't keep them artificially supported by machines. We turn the machines off. Sometimes they might be able to be an organ donor, other times they can't, but the machines ultimately get turned off within a few days. In this case, the machines were kept on through a court injunction for almost 400 days, over a year, where this woman who was dead had her organs supported by machines as the family and the physicians basically battled this out in court. And being in the courtroom was very uncomfortable. No doctor ever wants to end up in court battling with a family. We're there to support families. We're there to communicate death and tragedy. We take that job very seriously. And in this case, it became very contentious. And it's not the first time, and it won't be the last time. And it really highlighted to me the importance of talking about the subject, because nobody wants to end up in court trying to figure out if you're alive or dead. And the courts aren't the place for this either. I mean, it took 400 days, multiple appeals, and the young woman here, actually, her heart stopped on its own accord while the courts were still discussing this. So over a year, it wasn't the right place for this debate to happen. This debate should happen in people's living rooms and around the dining room table far in advance of a situation that is tragic.
Let's talk about palliative care.
Sure.
In what case is palliative care more of an answer than keeping someone hooked up to machines?
Yeah, that's a great question. Palliative care is an advancing field that focuses on people's comfort and joy and their quality of life as opposed to their longevity of life. And so when I say palliative care, a lot of people think, oh, we're giving up, or oh, that means life is going to be shorter. But there's some really interesting research that shows that once we stop medicalizing you, once we focus on your comfort, people can actually live longer than if they're medicalized. Their bodies seem to respond differently to the approach of palliative care. And so people can have a good end with quality time doing the things that matter to them, instead of being proceduralized, poked and prodded, living in an ICU, living in a hospital. It is, at the end of the day, a very personal choice for people to pursue palliative care, but it's one that most people probably aren't offered early enough or might not have a good enough understanding of, because it is such a rapidly shifting service that can be provided to people. So palliative care is not necessarily the opposite of critical care. I do a lot of palliative care in the ICU, but it's something that should probably be discussed for patients and their families to consider, as they also consider various medical interventions, so that they can choose sort of how they roll the dice.
All right, we have a few minutes left and a few more questions to get through, and I want to talk to you about MAID. Of course,
Sure.
this is something that's obviously being talked about. Among the many experts you spoke to Ashley White, a rural doctor who performs medical assistance in dying. What did she say about people who choose MAID? Because it's an interesting one, and one that sort of opened your eyes a little bit. So it's behind the sort of the socioeconomic factors as well behind that.
Yeah, MAID is obviously somewhat new to Canada, somewhat new to the medical field, generally speaking, but has proven, at least in Canada, to be somewhat popular. The uptake has been quite high amongst people who have a level of suffering that they just don't want to continue to experience. Ashley works in a rural area and drives hours and hours to meet with people who want MAID. And our observations are interesting that it's often people who have privilege or education, who are aware of MAID, who are aware of their choices, who request MAID. And we know now, as the MAID legislation is being, as proposed changes are perhaps coming forward, there's a lot of consideration about people who might not have access to healthcare. And so it's a little bit contentious in that you would hope that people wouldn't be suffering and choose to end their own life through MAID. But in order for that to be achieved, you have to have social services, you have to have adequate financial resources, you have to have an adequate effort at palliative care. You have to at least have, make sure that you're being treated fully medically before you throw in the towel, because we do know that we can improve people's lives with good old medical therapy before you end up in that situation. So MAID has brought about another option for the way people die when they're very unwell, but it certainly isn't the silver bullet to the problem that we have these days of the death dilemma.
All right, my last question to you. Is there difficult conversations, ones that you have not only with patients and their family, but with your friends as well? Overall, how are end-of-life conversations changing, and how do they need to evolve?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is people need to start having end-of-life conversations. I think I know that the majority of people I meet in the ICU have never had those conversations with their family members. The conversation itself, it means sitting down at the table and talking to your family about, hey, have you ever thought about how you might want to die, or what you would want done to you medically if you were in that situation? And many people can be very clear. They can say, I have lived a great life. I would never want to be medicalized. I would never want to be in an ICU or a nursing home. And often you can derive some of those clues from the way they've lived their lives. Some people have an awful lot of dignity, right? So I had a family recently who said, oh, Nana used to go to the hairdresser every week. She would put her makeup on before leaving the house. She was very, very proud. She really cared about her appearance, her integrity, her dignity, and what's happening to her now, she would be horrified. She just wouldn't want that. Whereas other people would say they had a zest for life, they have a grandchild due in 6 months, they would really want to push on and risk that sort of scenario of being incapacitated in a nursing home. So some people can be very, very clear about what they would want. And when families are clear with ICU teams, it does make our job much easier. We can honor that person's wishes without having to guess or argue or have family members sort of opposing each other in their interpretation of what their loved one would want.
All right. Blair, thank you so much. A very important conversation and a really good book. Thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.